Bon, merci Laure, merci à la famille Tocqueville, merci à la Fondation Tocqueville et tous les sponsors. Je crois qu'en fait que tous les trois ici, on est capable de faire cette conversation en française, mais je me suis dit que comme c'est la 80e anniversaire du débarquement et de la libération de l'Europe par les alliés principaux américains, qu'il est temps quand même qu'on parle un peu d'anglais ici. So I'm going to switch into English and thank you again to the foundation. Ouais, j'entends les appels là, mais quand même on va le faire en anglais. I'm going to switch in English. Thank you so much for letting me be here. As Laure mentioned, I have the pleasure of leading an organization called the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is present on many university campuses across the United States, trying to inspire a younger generation about how exceptional the United States is and the exceptional role it has to play in the world, which are, to me, givens, and something obviously that Tocqueville himself coined, who was born 1 year after Alexander Hamilton passed away, but something that is actually, I think, up for grabs in the United States today. There's a big debate about some of those things. And so I'd be happy to talk to anybody afterwards who's interested in what's going on in American college campuses. Laure graciously did the introductions of both Yascha and Dana here, so in the interest of time, I think I'm going to kind of move forward. And rather than, I think, do opening statements, we really just want to have a conversation. About 10 days ago, a bomb went off in American politics, which was the first presidential debate between the current president, President Biden, and the former president, President Trump. And even this week in France, other than talking about the French elections, I think the second most talked about topic was the state of the current president, not necessarily actually the worries that a lot of Europeans have over the previous one. And so my own circle of people, and you see it in the American press, is can the President of the United States serve another 4 years? Can he survive another 6 months? And the knives are out, and so the question is, can he actually survive as the nominee in the next 6 weeks before the Democratic Convention? So, Yascha, maybe I'll start with you first. Is what you are seeing in the last 10 days, is this a citizens' revolt against what seems to be a little bit of a mentally feeble president? Or is it actually a revolt of the Democratic elites, the big D Democratic elites, who are quite concerned by what they saw, that Biden may very well lose, in fact is likely at this point, to lose the election in November, and they are worried about what might happen to their own power, status, vision of what the United States should look like, that they are desperately seeking out some alternative that might be able to defeat Trump at the ballot?
One thing I learned when I was a student across the channel in England is that if you want to give a good answer, you have to reject the premise of a question. And I think it's neither nor. What we're seeing is the result of 10 years of failure of the American establishment. We had a debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump is in place because the conservative establishment of the United States has not been able to update itself to keep a genuine appeal to the bulk of the population outside of a quite crustified Washington, D.C. elite. And the result of that was Donald Trump's hostile takeover of a Republican Party. And then on the Democratic side, you have the result of 3 consecutive failures, which was first during the primaries in 2020. All of the rising candidates within the party, all of the journalists, all of the strategists thinking that the crazy things that were popular on Twitter at the time was the genuine voice of the Democratic base, and so everybody ran crazily to the left, and the only person left standing was Joe Biden, who was too old to know what was going on Twitter. The second failure was that for purely visual and demographic reasons, the Democratic Party chose a candidate who was very unpopular, who had polled terribly during the 2020 primaries, including, among the demographics that supposedly would support her. And so we have Kamala Harris as the Vice President of the United States, which, less popular than Joe Biden in most polls, and therefore the Democratic establishment was very, very reluctant to substitute Biden for a long time. And then the third failure was that when the first sign of Joe Biden's now obviously accelerating cognitive decline were becoming obvious over the last years, all of the mainstream journalists refused to tell the readers about it. They would tell each other, and they would tell me, and then they would go on CNN and say the opposite on air of what we're saying to each other privately. And as a result, it is now too late to have a genuinely open primary process in which the Democratic Party might be able to find a appealing, moderate candidate who would actually be able to win against Donald Trump. And so, now America is basically facing, as it looks today, the choice between a deeply irresponsible candidate in Donald Trump who has control of his mental faculty, a candidate who once upon a time was responsible but has clearly lost control of his mental faculties, which is Joe Biden, and a guy who isn't sure who committed 9/11 and ate a dog and has a brain worm, which is Mr. Kennedy. So that's the situation we're in. Are the Democrats going to be able to convince Joe Biden that it's in the best interest of his country and of his own health to step down? I would say the likelihood of that is around 50 to 66%. I assumed that would happen the day after the debate, but so far Democrats have rallied around him, and Biden seems deeply in denial about his own cognitive faculties. Are they going to be able to get around Kamala Harris even if Biden resigns? Probably not. And so the most likely outcome right now is that whether or not Biden is on the top of the ticket, Donald Trump is going to be re-elected president in November 2024. And so the winds that are rocketing this tent at the moment feel quite metaphoric.
Dana, both in government and in your career in the private sector, you've served in really the most senior communications position. I think all of us would agree what we saw on the debate screen wasn't necessarily a communications problem alone. But from what you've seen, do you think that the president can actually weather what's coming at him, both from his own party, from the media, and the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Economist have all called for him to step aside? How do you think that might happen if it happens at all? And what do you think about the vice president and whether she would actually step in or also be people move around her for some of the reasons that Yascha suggested?
Sure. So, d'abord, bonjour à tous. Merci à vous. Merci Jean-Guillaume, Laure, Thibault. Merci. Je suis toujours heureuse d'être en France parce que je me sens que les États-Unis, je me sens et sont mon mari. Mais la France est mon amour. So, merci. Mais, même si l'Alliance française a dit Dana est B1, mais non, je vais parler en anglais. So first, the problem is that the Democratic Party has painted itself into this diversity, equality, identity box when it comes to Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris got less than 2% in the primary. She had one fantastic line in one debate that, as I would put it, was a punch towards just white guilt, right? Like she punched at an old white guy who has been in the Senate a very long time, who had been friends with grand dragons. Senator Byrd was a grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and Strom Thurmond, and he'd known these men. And so she kind of took a sucker punch at him, and I think that propelled her for that moment that he felt guilty, and it was like this moment, I can't be seen as the old white guy who stood against integration, and she got on the ticket. Now the problem is, now she's on the ticket, and black women are the most consistent voting bloc of any demographic in the United States, and they vote 98% for the Democratic Party. Now, I can go into a long discussion about why that is, but they are the most loyal. So they cannot, as much as they want to, get rid of Kamala. They cannot, because that will be an affront to black women. Black women will not show up, and they will lose, period, dot. Do I think there's any sentiment to get rid of Biden? There's a lot, but unfortunately, I think, which is characteristic of several of our baby boomer presidents, is they don't let go. They won't let go. I don't think Biden will let go. I think the only person who could convince Biden to let go is Jill. But he's not going to let go, and I think she likely likes being first lady. And remember, we've had other presidents who were less than competent. Woodrow Wilson was less than competent towards the end, and there were rumors his wife was running the show. So there's a lot of advantages as first lady with a husband who is less than there. So I don't think they can get rid of him. It's so funny that the Democratic Party is the party of superdelegates, where the hierarchy kind of can come together and say, yes, you can be the nominee, no, you can't be the nominee. But I think he's going to run. I don't wish any harm on any, and I don't even want to put that out there, but I think his faculties will be greatly diminished in a second term. But I'll let you ask my question. I don't necessarily think it's a foregone conclusion that Trump wins, but okay.
Well, so let me just follow up on that. I'm glad there's a little bit of a difference between two of you, because Yascha's saying it's slightly more likely than not that actually he won't be the candidate. You said 50 to 66%. You're saying actually the opposite. But I think what's a little bit forgotten in this debate is that one of them is actually the current president. And so it's not simply a question of, what happens from January 20th, 2025 onwards. It's also a question of the next 6 months. Again, you've served in the Pentagon in a couple different positions, a strong background on a lot of China questions. Are you worried that based on what we are seeing coming out of the leader of the free world right now, that if we are all looking at this, if American citizens are looking at this, then American adversaries are looking at this as well? And so how do you deal with the problem of today? Never mind just the question of who might win the election and what the next 4 years look like. How do you actually deal with the problem of today?
I think the problem today is that I don't know exactly who's running the country. I think that's the problem. It's probably Jake Sullivan. It's probably a combination.
Who's the National Security Advisor.
National Security Advisor. I think it's probably Jill Biden. I think there's probably some hand-holding that Obama is doing, but that's a problem. And living in the free world, that frightens me. If I'm not living in the free world, I see an opportunity. I see chaos. I see confusion. I see an America that seems off and old, and easily confused. And that's not just the White House. I mean, that's across the political spectrum. I mean, we don't have to talk about the House, but the House, like all facets of these pillars of American democracy are sort of under attack. Our judicial system is under attack. Our Congress is under attack. Even we eat our own young. There was a cat fight in the we've lost our true north, and that concerns me.
And I just want to add one small thing, which is that the argument for the last years has been Joe Biden is a little bit old and he's a little bit out of it, but he has this great team of trustworthy professionals who are running the show. And, I'm sure you know some of these people. I know some of these people. Jake Sullivan, I know somewhat well. They are people who are very competent and very impressive, and that, I think, was part of what allowed people to go along with this. But what the debate revealed is that those people, from starting with Kamala Harris down to Jake Sullivan and a lot of other people in the broader machinery of the Democratic administration, have been lying to us for at least 6 months and probably 2 or 3 years, because they have gone out in private settings and they have gone out in public settings again and again and told us that the president is sharp as a tack, that he's running circles around everybody else, that he's more on top of his briefs than his smartest advisors. And it's now quite obvious that they were lying when they were saying that. So the supposedly trustworthy team cannot be trusted, and that's an additional problem.
So let me, Yascha, go back to you on this. So the current president has literally the lowest approval ratings of any president in modern history of the United States. Lower than President Trump at the same time in his presidency, lower than President Carter. The former president is also deeply unpopular, has incredibly low approval rates even in his post-presidency or inter-presidency in that way. If the election were held today, from the pure popular vote perspective, both men would win a lower share of the popular vote than they respectively won 4 years ago, and then Trump even won in 2016 when he actually won the presidency. So explain to me if it seems like there are so many Americans, and there's a poll recently that said that something like 30% of Americans disapprove of both at the same time. So if there are so many Americans who did not want this matchup, and rematches are rare in American politics. The last one was 1956, and before that you have to look in the early 19th century. Why did we get it? What is it about both men or both parties, or maybe there's another way of looking at that, somehow, I don't mean stymied in some conspiratorial sense, but stymied what seems to be the direction of the American people?
I'll give 3 answers. Number 1, institutional, it's the primary system. I am in favor of democracy. I am appalled by the extent to which many educated people nowadays seem to distrust the people. I think part of what it is to be a small d Democrat is to trust that the majority of the people is going to have reasonable moral instinct and get things right most of the time. That doesn't mean I agree with the majority in every opinion poll. I sometimes disagree with the majority of my fellow citizens, as does everybody. But you have to have a basic trust. What I don't believe in is a political system like the primaries in which 8 to 10% of the population have outsized influence over who are the candidates. And it's always, the people who show up to those primaries are the most politically engaged, which means they're the most ideological and the most radical. So either you have to have a real democratic system, like a general election, in which hopefully 60, 70, 80% of the people participate, or you have to have people with a stake in the system making decisions about who the candidate might be. The primary system, which empowers the 10% of most progressive Americans to choose the Democratic candidate and the 10% of most conservative Americans to choose the Republican candidate, is a disaster. And that explains why you end up with bad choices. The second explanation I have is that American elites have completely divorced themselves from the ordinary citizens. And this is always a problem, right? Elites are always in danger of getting disconnected socially, culturally, in terms of their values from the bulk of the population. But it is much more extreme in the United States, including the disdain that those groups now have for ordinary citizens. And so one of the problems of the Democratic Party is that a generic Democrat would easily win against Donald Trump, because as you're saying, Donald Trump is deeply toxically unpopular, and he's deeply toxically unpopular for a good reason. But Americans actually think that Joe Biden is more extreme than Donald Trump, and the Democratic Party is more extreme than the Republican Party, and that's because of a hold that small groups of activists have over the party platform and its policies. So that's, I think, a second reason for how we got into that. And the third reason, let's be a little bit self-critical, is that clearly we as a political class, and I'm including everybody here in this room, whether you want it or not under that label, are out of ideas. And I want to make 2 apologies to you all. The first is that we're standing between you and lunch. I promise we're not going to go on for too long. But the second is to be rude about this wonderful conference, which I'm very, very privileged to be invited back to for the second time. And I've met wonderful people over the last 48 hours, and it's such a lovely setting and it's an important set of conversations. But I think if you look at the theme of Wake Up Citizens and you look at the amount of substance we've been able to put forward and the amount of innovative solutions that we've discussed in the last 2 days and the kind of offer that makes to citizens who say, I'm not trusting the political system, I don't feel represented, I don't feel heard, I don't trust all of you to have the solutions, I don't think we've done very well for the last 2 days. And it's because we as a broader political class have not done very well for the last 10 years. So we're a symptom as much as we are a solution.
I just want to push back on one thing you said and then go to Dana. On the second reason you gave, in terms of the elites, and we can argue whether Trump, after he became president, is he in the elites or is he not in the elites in that way? But it's certainly true that in 2016, he was not the establishment candidate. And I would even argue after his presidency and in the most recent primary, there were 9 or 10 opponents. He still wasn't the establishment candidate, right? I mean, the donors were backing different places, the conservative media were backing different places, and despite all that, he actually ran running away, whereas on the Biden side, they moved hell and earth to try and prevent primary challenges to the president. So I just want to challenge you on a little bit. I don't know if you agree with that assessment or not.
I do, but I'd love to hear what Dana thinks on this. But in the Democratic Party, an establishment that is out of tune with the views of most Americans and the views of its supposed base still is in charge, right? That is why Democrats think their base is young, non-white voters who are super progressive. But when you look at the numbers, Biden has capped roughly the same vote share among old white voters as he had in 2020, and he's hemorrhaging votes among Asian Americans, among Latino voters, particularly among African American voters. And it's not because young black voters, for example, are way more progressive than Joe Biden. It's because they think that Joe Biden has taken on a set of progressive views that are popular among highly educated, highly affluent people who have master's degrees from Smith College or from Harvard, that they deeply disagree with. So I think on the Democratic side, it's a question of an establishment still being in charge that is out of keeping with the views of its base. On the Republican side, it's a matter of a similar establishment having been in charge for a long time, such that it has complete control over its own base and over its own electorate. And then that electorate staged a successful rebellion, putting in Donald Trump, who has the one virtue of having broken with that consensus, but the great defect of being politically incoherent and irresponsible.
So Dana, I'd love your thoughts on that. And in answering that also, you worked in the previous Trump administration in the Department of Defense. My own sense is that if in a second potential Trump term, that the Trump campaign and those around Trump are more organized. They have a bit more of a coherent or consistent set of policies that they'd like to implement. Some of it is unfinished business, some of it is undoing some things Biden done, but some of it is new. I'm curious your sense of whether the change in kind of political coalitions that Yascha just mentioned, will that have an impact, do you think, on a Trump 2 agenda in terms of what they might actually do?
I think it already has. I agree with you that they are more polished. They are doing more things the traditional way. They were getting the right think tanks. They want to get the right team. And we were talking earlier, there's a difference between Trump and Trump's administration. I served in the first one. And he had some really excellent people in his team, especially my old boss, General Mattis. But he had a fantastic team. The problem with popularism, and you've seen it multiple times, and what ultimately has gotten people so rattled about Trump on both sides of the aisle, which I think is important to understand. I mean, most of my friends were never Trumpers. They signed up and said, I will not vote for him. And I told them that is a mistake. Just stay silent. Don't say anything, because he doesn't have anyone. He has his family. He has nothing. He's gonna need you Bushies. He's gonna need you guys to run the State Department and the Department of Defense. And because I feel like popularism comes up under 2 circumstances: hypocrisy or failure. Reagan changed things because Carter was a failure, and he brought back all of the kind of working class. He brought that, the Reagan Democrats. Clinton, young, new, fresh, he was able to hear people. He related to people. There is something that has changed with boomers where it has stopped being about, I want a president or a leader who's better than me. I want a leader who's like me. And that's a big difference. And Trump is a little different than all of us, right? Like Trump is very attuned to people who have been unseen both by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party for many, many years. And they are tired. And I can say this, it is very difficult to be a straight white male in America right now. It just is. I can feel it. And these are men and families who are doing what they always thought they were supposed to do. They're working their jobs. They're doing what they did. They used to be able to work a job and buy a place in Florida. They're seeing that all go away. They're seeing immigrants coming across the border, getting cell phones and rent and staying in the Roosevelt Hotel in New York and making a mess. And even immigrants, you're shutting down my school to let illegal immigrants stay there. Trump had over 2,000 people in the Bronx. And what was the Democratic elite's response to that? The governor of New York, Governor Hochul, said, those folks who showed up, they're a bunch of clowns. That is the Democrats' elitist mindset that killed, there were lots of reasons that killed Hillary. But her saying, you're a bunch of deplorables. I'm not even gonna bother you with you, Michigan. I'm not even gonna bother you with Wisconsin. Trump went there. And there is something in the base of like Americans' hearts, like, I need you to understand me. And I might not like you. I've had many Trump supporters say, look, I wouldn't want him dating my daughter. I wouldn't want him coming to dinner. I wouldn't hang out with him. I wouldn't play golf with him. But I felt safer. My 401k looked really good. The Chinese were in check. He took out ISIS. I mean, that's not bad. I mean, yeah, you don't like his tweets, but his policies, and having worked at the Department of Defense, I will tell you, from a media standpoint, I think the media is the biggest failure. Because there were over 22 American hostages held during Obama's years. I never heard a news report about it. I would get phone calls constantly. Hey, Dana, we're getting 2 people out of North Korea. We're getting them out of Turkey. They're the family in Afghanistan. I'm like, what are you talking about? He was getting all of these hostages out. It used to be that when you took an American hostage, it meant something. Like, you heard about it constantly. And I also had to deal with North Korea shooting off missiles every 3-day holiday. I promise you, it was every 3-day holiday. It was 4th of July, all of them.
So if we cancel the holidays, there's no North Korean missiles?
It was awful. I will tell you, Gabe, it was awful because you knew it was coming because you knew it. It's like, I have 1 3-day weekend, boom. And then suddenly Donald Trump he's like, enough, Rocket Man. And it stopped. And I had 4th of July again and Labor Day again. And so that's a long way of saying that Trump is popular because both sides, political elites, have ignored the people that most matter. The people who pay taxes, the people who want to raise their children and want to not walk past drug addicts and needles when they're taking their kids to school. And he's not afraid to say that and do something about it.
And he just, on the hostage point, in that debate from 10 days ago, he actually talked about the Wall Street Journal journalist who's been held hostage by Putin. And that he said something to the effect of, Putin will release him before I even come to office. He's at other times spoken about there are actually 8 Americans being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza, 5 of whom we still believe to be alive. He's talked about those. And I also mentioned you evoked Bill Clinton. People don't realize this, but Bill Clinton today is younger than both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. which I think is something that is sort of a mind warp in that way. Yascha.
The other way to do this calculation is that if you take Jordan Bardella, you take Gabriel Attal, and you add Emmanuel Macron, you get just about to Joe Biden's age. A little bit more, but...
Yeah, Yascha, you agree with what Dana just said, but the bigger thing is it does seem like the big D, and to a certain degree the big R, Republican elites, big Democratic Republican elites, didn't learn the lesson of 2016 when it came to Donald Trump. They continued to attack, belittle many of his supporters. We don't have time to go in fully into it, but use the court system in a variety of ways, I think, to try to hamstring him. Prior to the debate, I think the Biden campaign would tell you what's their number one strategy is they think it's calling him convicted felon, convicted felon, convicted felon over and over and over again. Why do you think they didn't learn the lesson? I mean, right now we're talking about character and leadership. We're not even talking about policies.
Because we're in a bubble. I was at a gathering, very interesting bipartisan gathering in Washington, D.C. About a month ago, and a senior Democratic leader, not an elected politician, but somebody who's very influential in the Democratic coalition, said, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, it does so many things for people in rural America. Why is it that we're not making any advance in rural America? Why is it that those people will just not consider voting for the Democratic Party at all? And I responded, and a few others responded in a similar vein. The problem is you don't have permission to speak because they think that on a whole set of cultural issues, you are just way out of where the American people stand. And so you talked about some things like immigration, right? Another example is that the United Kingdom has recently had a new report on transgender care for minors, led by Hilary Cass, a renowned pediatrician, that found that the evidence base at the moment for medical transitions of 14, 15-year-olds just is not there. We don't know what the long-term impact of this is going to be. It's likely going to lead to a great loss in bone density. It certainly leads to infertility for many of the people who get those cross-gender hormones. And therefore, the NHS should not offer that to minors. The incoming Labour government won a majority in part because they are willing to engage with the science and engage with the facts. And after this report came out, Wes Streeting, who's now a senior cabinet minister as of yesterday, said, we will comply with the recommendations of the Hilary Cass report. In the United States, the Democrats refuse to do the same thing and say that anybody who has concerns about this very complicated, very difficult details is just a transphobe who's a bigot and who has to be thrown out, right? And so part of the answer that I gave is that you end up with people saying, we just don't trust you on these cultural issues. So if you're telling us you don't do this for us in the economy, that for us in the economy, we just are not going to listen. And what was the response of this senior Democratic figure? She said, what you're saying is that we should give up the most vulnerable people, that we should sell them out. We're not willing to do that. And that is not what's the case. You can be very, very empathetic towards trans people. You can recognize that we should have more respect for them, that there's, of course, parts of the United States and of France and other countries where they still suffer from tremendous amount of prejudice, that they should, in a liberal society, be free to live their lives as they choose, and yet engage seriously with things like this report in the United Kingdom and many other countries that raise those kind of problems without being in danger of being denounced as a terrible person by the entire mainstream media and the apparatus of a Democratic Party. And so I think that is a huge part of why Democrats just don't have the trust of large segments of a population that used to reliably vote for them in the past. And as we're seeing with somebody like Keir Starmer, who's not an inspirational figure, who's not a great figure of light, who's not a once-in-a-generation political talent, is that when you actually move into the center of society with a vision that remains tolerant and remains progressive, you can win significant majorities. And if only Democrats were able to put up somebody as boring and uninspirational and sensible as Keir Starmer, they would easily win against Donald Trump.
So the authorities at Bay say we have 9 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of them. So please put your hands up. If there are a bunch, I might even take a couple at a time so that our guests can answer it. I see Andrew up front. If there's another hand somewhere. And then the gentleman in the red pants over there on the right.
Thank you very much, and very interesting discussion. I'd like to redirect, if I may, a little bit and address something that Yascha said about the competent people running the government. Are you kidding me? Look at how we withdrew from Afghanistan, our national security policy, not our finest hour. Deterrence failed 3 times over the last 3 years. 2022 invasion of Ukraine, we tried to deter that. We declassified tons of intel. He went in. Israel, the closest ally of the United States, is attacked by Hamas with the endorsement of the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the rest of it. And finally, when the Iran threatens to hit Israel with missiles and the president says, don't do it, the Iranians say, yo mama, and they do it, which, by the way, is a political science term, right? So my point is, I'm back in Washington 9 months. This is not just about personalities. I watched a discussion with congressional staffers, and a guy from the audience said, if you're so smart, how come I don't have a job? Okay, I hear the same conversations. There's a deeper structural problem, and I'd like for you to talk to it.
And I think there's a second question over here.
Hello, I am Constantin Vaillantenzer, and yeah, my question is about, maybe it's very French point of view, but I have the impression that in some way American politics are paying the fact that they are not working well, in the sense that there depends a lot of private donors, and it seems like in popular culture for decades that politics are forgetting about people and only taking care of their own interests. And do you think it's like this thing is very deep, it seems very deeply rooted in the American popular culture? And do you think that Trump saying that I am someone independent, I can say whatever I want to say, even if it's very messy and, well, you know about Donald Trump tweets. Do you think it's this thing that is making Trump so attractive and Democrats not able to cope it with?
Which of you want to answer which one?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I agree with everything, and so you. Short and sweet. Yeah, I agree.
No, look, I mean, I think Afghanistan in particular was a disastrous failure by the Biden administration. We were talking about this yesterday. I mean, it's partially the illusion of competence that was breached, and partially the appeal that Joe Biden has as somebody who I think is generally empathetic towards people who've experienced loss, and there's countless stories of him being able to grieve with people given his own tragic family history and so on. But when it came to our allies in Afghanistan and to people who were bravely fighting to preserve some semblance of democracy, and more importantly, some semblance of basic rights for people in that society, Biden quite clearly said, I don't care, I don't have empathy for them. They're not within my circle of sympathy. And I think that was a substantive failure, and it was damaging in terms of public opinion as well. I do think that because of the chaos of the Trump years, that we should also not underestimate, because sure, he had a great team, but he also fired all of his great team over the course of those 4 years, including your boss.
Technically, he resigned first. So
correct, yes. But you know, I think people did look until recently at that team and say, look, we didn't like what happened in Afghanistan, we don't feel that he carries a big enough stick, and there's all kinds of worries we have, but it does feel like people who vaguely know what they're doing are in charge, even if we don't love them. I think that the problem of trust and confidence in purely electoral terms is deeply aggravated by Biden's performance in the debate and by the realization that, everybody from the administration to his vice president to people on CNN have been lying to you for a good number of months. So while I'll take your point, I think in terms of public perception that's made a difference. And the polls, it may be a reality, well, it's both. There's a reality and there's the extent to which people perceive it. And I think the fact that the polls have moved sharply away from Biden over the course of the last week is an indication that that had an impact.
So I just wanted to answer the gentleman's question over here. One of the problems or challenges and why it's so appropriate to be here at Chateau de Tocqueville is for the American, the individual is so supreme, but it's governed by a certain set of principles. We don't have thousands of years of culture. We don't have a monolithic group. We are a diverse group of people who have come from all over the world for one purpose, is to fulfill this idea and to be a part of the American experiment. And so there's always been this tension between the rights of the individual versus those of the community and those of the government, the Bill of Rights, right? So we have a very different mindset about what our responsibility is. And what bothers me about what's happening now is Americans are not taught civic education. They don't know what their responsibilities. And in a democracy, you have to know your responsibility. You need to know what the government's responsibility is. You need to know what your responsibility is. And if you don't, then that's where tyranny and authoritarian rises, because everyone's gotten kind of fat, happy, and dumb. And people do things, and they're looking at their phones constantly, and they're not thinking, they're not looking for facts. And that's the greatest threat, and that's why I'm glad we're talking about citizenship. But in America, there is always this tension, but the issue is we have all come together, whether you're the legacy of the slave, or you're an immigrant, or you're a Mayflower person, right? We all have the same hope for making a more perfect nation. That is what unites Americans. And it doesn't need to be the same way. I don't have to agree with you, but I have to at least respect you. And I think our founding fathers were brilliant in the way they balanced power so that ultimately, Congress can't figure it out, Supreme Court guess what? It's gonna go back to you. Because at the end of the day, you know what's best for you, and that's what our founding fathers believed.
I just want to add one quick response to that question. I don't think that people see Trump as trustworthy or as not corrupt. And the polls indicate that, because in fact, both Biden and Trump are deeply unpopular. And Trump is deeply unpopular when you look at his approval ratings. I think the difference, though, is best explained by my favorite moment in the 2016 presidential campaign, which now feels prehistoric. And it's when both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were asked why it is that Hillary Clinton, embarrassingly, was a guest at Donald Trump's wedding. And Hillary Clinton gave a very implausible answer, if you know anything about her. She said, because I thought it would be fun. And people thought, your idea of fun is not to hang out at Donald Trump's wedding. And Donald Trump gave an answer that was honest in its dishonesty, which is to say that was open about the fact that he is a wheeler dealer who's in it for himself. He said, I'm a real estate developer in New York. I need powerful people like the Clintons on my side. So of course I invited them. So I don't think it's that people think Trump is not corrupt, that he's altruistic, that he's public-spirited. It's that he is open about the corruption of the American establishment in the way in which most members of the American establishment are not open about it.
Let's go to Laure for la question finale.
Yes, I had a last question. According to what you said, Trump has good chances to be president of the United States again. So my question is the following. The Democratic Party keeps repeating that Trump is a threat to the American Republic. Do you believe, both of you, that Trump, if he comes back, will be a threat to the American Republic?
I do not think he will be a threat to the American Republic. I think people need to also remember history. Like, there was a man beaten to death in the well of the Senate. Like, there's a lot that has happened in America, and we continue, and our institutions continue. The one thing, and it has nothing to do with Donald Trump, it has to do with the American people and understanding their role in safeguarding the gift that they've been given. And if that doesn't depend on Donald Trump, that depends on us questioning and fulfilling our roles as citizens.
So I think we need to stop thinking of democracy in ones and zeros. That's a problem that we've had for a long time in this debate about populism and authoritarianism. Countries aren't either fully democratic or they're complete dictatorships. I think, as I was saying to somebody I was having this debate with earlier, I think thinking that Trump is a fascist and that the moment he comes into power, democracy in America is over is a wild exaggeration. But I do think that there is a risk of serious damage to the quality of American democracy and the independence of its institutions. And one of the reasons is that Trump this time around is going to be very different from what he was in 2016. In 2016, he knew relatively little about politics. He did not feel that he had a reason to attack the independence of various institutions. He did not have his own team coming in, as you were pointing out. He had very little control over the Republican Party. Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House for the first 2 years of Trump's presidency. And he didn't really have a very concrete program. This time he's coming in with full control of the Republican Party, with very loyal staffers who have had 4 years of experience in government and have learned much better how to deal with these institutions, with a plan formulated by the Heritage Foundation and others for how he should attack independent institutions from day one, and in a much more, in some ways understandably, much more angry frame of mind than he was in 2016. And so I think that the assault on how American democracy works is going to be very, very different. And then I think you have to think in probabilities. There's a probability that all of that project will be a failure and that nothing much happens, and that perhaps that ends up reinforcing democratic institutions. There's, I think, a high probability that it undermines the rule of law in various ways, creates various problems, all of which have real consequences, but it's not going to be a huge and lasting effect. And then I think there is a small but real probability that he does succeed, and that the United States will start to look more similar to places like Hungary, which, despite the protestations of one of my previous speakers, is not exactly a democratic paradise today.
I just want to say one thing, because Trump gets labeled with everyone, that's the talking point. If he comes in, what happens to democracy? I just want to point out that President Biden decided to forgive student loans for students, which is clearly like a buy-off for young voters, right? The Supreme Court told him he could not. Shot him down. It's something Congress. It's a money thing. It's a Congress thing. You can't universally decide to do that. He still did it. So when people talk about who's I mean, again, Trump is not, the best of, but he's got 91 counts against him. Hillary Clinton destroyed evidence and like cracked laptops, and they said, let's leave it alone. It's not worth going after. I mean, there is something that the American people also just feel deeply, whether Republican or Democrat, when just something just doesn't feel fair. Like, the Department of Justice has been weaponized against people who you guys don't know Bass, but like, who go and buy guns at sporting shops, like the IRS. Like, so when people talk about Trump's going to destroy democracy, I just would ask people to look a little deeper on things that are actually being done by the people who are always saying, he's going to destroy democracy, he's going to destroy democracy. And these people don't even show up for subpoenas. Like, they don't show up for oversight. So So again, I think, I will say for Europe, having been a part of the administration, my final thought, if Trump wins, he is going to scare you all. I have no doubt that he's going to scare you all, and he will do things that will make you very nervous. But I do believe he understands U.S. interests, and I do think he believes he does things in the interest of the American people as he sees it, and obviously our security relationship and our political, our principles, and our shared characters are incredibly important for the security of the world.
Well, I want to, yes, thank you for that. And I just want to close on 2024 is the first year in over a century that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France have all had national elections in the same year. We're living, one is complete, we're in the middle of another one, and the third is yet to come. There's one thing about the American experiment, as was seen, and I'll read a brief section, and Alexander Hamilton wrote about this in Federalist 1, which is the real question of the United States is whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. And so I hope this debate continues over lunch, but whatever it is, I do feel like, at least in the United States, there is a lot of reflection, and they are making their choices over what comes next. So thank you both for engaging in this conversation. Thank you to the Fondation.
Thank you.